Hello, everybody. I'm Alex. I'm head of product at Instruqt. And today we're going to be talking to you about Instruqt 2.0. It's myself giving you a little bit of context and our wonderful co-founder and staff engineer, Eric, who's going to give you the demo, a live demo of our new product. You may have heard of Instruqt 2.0, or you may have heard of it referred to as Next. That was just simply a name for a long-running rebuild initiative that we've been doing. But in the spirit of a true developer workflow, when something earns a version bump, you name it like one. And we are really, really proud of this new version of Instruqt. So we've named it so, right? This is Instruqt 2.0. Before I hand over to Eric, I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving you context on why we did this. And what Instruqt 2.0 represents. And then Eric will show you the things that you're probably here to see. And then one last piece of housekeeping before we get in, and before I entertain Eric way too much. I see a lot of familiar faces on this call. You're probably familiar with Instruqt, but if you're not, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what Instruqt is and what we do. So Instruqt is a platform that helps go-to-market teams reach their goals, whether that's adoption, leads, improving the sales cycle, with hands-on experiences, because buyers today really want to try a product before they buy it, right? And Instruqt started in the education space, helping customers really drive adoption and improve onboarding, but it's become an incredibly valuable tool at every stage in the buying journey. From marketing, who can use it to generate more leads and qualify those leads, to sales and pre-sales, who can use it to shorten the sales cycle and the amount of effort they need to put in to prove value of their product. And then, as I said, education that improves adoption and retention. So if you're a prospect and you want to know more about Instruqt, send us a mail at hello@instruqt.com. hello@instruqt.com. All right. Why does Instruqt 2.0 exist? Well, when Instruqt started, hands-on learning itself was still fairly new, right? Our early customers were highly technical. They were very comfortable working in code and command line workflows. But over time, hands-on learning itself has changed, as you can see from the slide above, right? It's attracted new use cases and new user roles. And as the industry has grown and we've grown and our customers have grown, more content has been built. You've grown your teams and you've relied on Instruqt in more places in your organization. That brings new roles and new challenges. And the success of this product and the growth of you as customers, of your libraries, of your teams, has introduced new challenges and friction points. That's not because it's broken, but because growth brings change, right? It brings new needs. So we went and tried to understand exactly what was hampering or where we could improve or how we could help our customers. What were the challenges they were facing? And we started to see patterns emerging. One of the first ones is that the learning curve became steeper as the complexity of our product grew, right? We added new things. It's an incredibly flexible product, and you as developers and builders can do a lot with it. But because of this complexity, new people can often feel overwhelmed, and it's difficult to actually get started and understand how to get going with Instruqt. Teams who have been building lots of content and growing their libraries have not been able to improve the speed at which they build content, even though their library has been getting bigger. And that's because things were not as modular and reusable as you as users would like, or as we should be supporting you. And then again, because it's so technical, because it's so complex, because it's so flexible, there's a lot of hidden dependencies within it, within Instruqt as you build content. And this makes content creation itself more difficult, time-consuming, and then debugging your content itself is also difficult because you're doing a lot of back and forth iteration. And as I mentioned earlier, another pattern is that as your teams expanded and different people got involved, collaboration became more important, and the product wasn't initially built to support that kind of collaboration. So code-first users and UI-first users started to have some friction as they collaborated. And also, even if you're in the same workflow, there was challenges with multiple people working on content at the same time. And then finally, as teams have grown and built lots of content, their libraries have become more difficult to manage, more difficult to maintain and keep up to date. And identifying the most up-to-date source of truth about a piece of content became exceptionally challenging. So with all of these challenges in mind, Instruqt 2.0 is the foundation that's going to address them, right? We're trying to bring you more value depending on your use case, what your goal is, but also at the heart of it, it's about making it easier for you to actually create content so you can focus on reaching the outcomes that you need to reach, whether that's leads, improved sales, which is better education or more adoption. So the foundation focuses on an explicit structure, right? Making it clearer, visible, making those dependencies visible and understandable. It focuses on earlier validation. You as a builder, you want feedback faster and you want that feedback actionable. You want to understand exactly what steps to take to fix it. And then we've also focused on improving the workflows so that it supports both code-based users and UI-based users, and so that you can collaborate effectively and also manage change more effectively. And then the thing that I'm most excited about is that it's a foundation that enables reuse, right? Part of Instruqt 2.0 is that it brings in modules. It allows you to reuse content, and it's going to support you in scaling your library and your content and your teams over time. Now, this is just the first iteration. We're incredibly excited about it, but it's not going to solve everything overnight, but it's definitely establishing a platform that can evolve more quickly and move forward more safely, right? And I'm saying that more in the sense of there is so much opportunity in front of us, and I'm so excited about us. And this first iteration is going to be better than our existing product already, but we know that there's always more we can do to solve those challenges and support and help you as users and grow the hands-on experience sector and industry. So 2 quick questions that I imagine are on the minds of our existing customers and users is, when can I get it? And what about all the content I already have? So when can you get it? If you'd like early access, reach out to us. You can have it as soon as possible. There's just a limit in what you'll be able to do at this stage. So the capabilities that you need for your use case depend on when you can have it and when it would be the right time for you to have it. But we're targeting April and May for you to have almost 90% parity with the capabilities of the existing product. And then about migration. So there's going to be no forced switch, right? We're not sunsetting the old product and leaving you hanging. You're going to have time to understand the new version of the product, get used to it. And we're going to offer migration toolkit to help you with the migration. And you'll also be able to mix content. So for a while, you'll be able to use your old content with your new content in the same sharing mechanic and be able to report on that. So please, if you have more questions about that, reach out to our team. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Eric, who's going to show you the most exciting parts. All yours, Eric.
All right. Thank you, Alex. All right. So instead of just going through slides or doing it in VS Code, I thought I'd just create an actual lab and then showcase the lab from inside the lab so you can actually experience what Instruqt 2.0 also feels like for the end user, because there's some big changes there as well, right? So I'm in my Instruqt 2.0 lab, right? And then as a lab creator, you'll probably recognize some of those challenges that Alex already talked about, right? Things like dependency management, asset sprawl. How do I deal with finding errors quickly? How do I collaborate? And then also, how do I make sure that change management is way easier, right? So first problem that I want to address is the dependency challenge. And this has partly to do with the hidden complexity that Alex was talking about. So let's say, for instance, we're building a lab, and in our lab, we want a fairly standard observability stack, right? So we have Grafana, Prometheus, Loki, and maybe some applications, right? So the app must be up before Prometheus can scrape it. Prometheus needs to be ready before Grafana can connect to it. And then all of these components also need configuration that depend on all of those dependencies, right? So the big question then is, like, how do you manage the ordering of all of these components? And how do I get the data from one place to another and these config files to be generated and then inserted in all these places, right? So the traditional approach is your only solution that you had, and that is bash scripts, right? And what also came with that is that often people were just using containers, but because they needed to orchestrate everything around them, they chose to run a VM as their actual host so that they can do this orchestration in their giant bash script. Because otherwise it becomes even more complicated when you have these distributed containers that all start at exactly the same time. How do I then manage that ordering? There's no way to do that, right? So a lot of people end up with something like this, where, all right, run the first Docker container, right? Then I need to have an until loop that polls that container until it's ready. Then I sleep every time until it's healthy. Probably the logs are filled with more dots in sleep cycles than you can imagine. And then once it's healthy, I can then grab information from that demo app. Then I need to here doc my configuration, because there's no other easy way for me to get this variable in there. And then once this is generated, I can then mount that in my next container. And then if you have a dependency of application, Prometheus, Loki, Grafana, and all those config files, you can imagine that this gets complex very quickly. And everything happens in sequence. And if anything breaks, the whole stack basically falls down. And it's very hard to pinpoint why things are going wrong, right? Especially when you have timeouts and things like that, where sometimes something takes a little bit longer. Suddenly I have a sleep of 30 seconds and it times out suddenly because my loop ended too quickly, right? Or you get stuck in infinite loops, which is even worse because your track never starts, you don't get any error messages, etc. Right? So what does it turn into? There's customers that have scripts of over 5,000 lines of bash scripts, like very elaborate error handling in there with timeouts and retries and all of that. But like one of the big issues is that if you have any files and it's in here doc, all the syntax within that is not syntax highlighted. So if you make any mistakes in there, they are really hard to catch, right? So that's almost impossible to do. And any misplaced quote in that one huge script can ruin something way down that you haven't intended. And then it's really hard to actually find that problem, right? And so you basically have engineers that spend hundreds of hours of time maintaining these scripts instead of actually working on content and creating content. And then it still is brittle when there's a race condition or some timing issue or performance issue, which is really horrible because they always happen when you least expect it. Like some business impact of this is that you're wasting engineering time, it's hard to debug these failures, and nothing happens in parallel. So startup times are actually way longer than they need to be just because we have all those sleeps in there. All right.
So it even inadvertently makes your end users experience less ideal, right? Because they have to wait longer for the lab to start.
Yes, cool. Exactly, right? So what is another option? Well, the solution we've taken is to have a declarative configuration where you basically have implicit or explicit dependencies defined, right? So what you basically do is you declare the items you want. So in this case, I want a container for my demo app. It's using a Docker image and it has ports defined, right, where we can reach it. And then if I want to use the container name of that demo application, which is only known once the application or the container is actually started, I can then just reference that value of that container, and then that automatically creates an implicit dependency so that the creation of this template will actually wait for that container to be created, right? And then you probably haven't heard of templates in this sense, because that's another type of resource that we're introducing next to containers and VMs and networks and those kind of things. Is for your files, you also have templates, right? Where you can basically ingest a local file and then output it to temporary directory or another local file, and then basically replace values inside of that template. So this means that I no longer need to cat and here doc all of those config files. I can have normal syntax highlighting, easy debugging, testing locally. And then if I need the values in there, I just input them using a reference, and then that gets replaced in that template, right? And then templates are part of this dependency graph that the system creates, so that if I then have Prometheus, which depends on that Prometheus config resource, I can just reference it and then mount that directly in the Prometheus container, so that that dependency tree gets automatically built up, right? So demo app needs to be ready, then the template needs to be created, and once the template is rendered, it can be mounted in Prometheus, and Prometheus can start, right? And so this basically creates that chain without any scripting, and the system takes care of all of those dependencies. All you do is define the end state that you want. Now, sometimes when containers start, they're not ready yet, right? Let's say my demo application needs to first connect to some other things. So every resource that has a runtime component to it also has health checks themselves, so that the resource can actually health check itself, and so that the next resource in that dependency graph will not start up until it's actually healthy, right? So in this case, we're polling the health C endpoint of the demo app, or this is another very common thing. Let's say I have a Postgres container. When the Postgres container starts, it often takes some time for it to initialize. And so otherwise containers would be failing when they're trying to connect because Postgres is not ready yet. So we can use an exec health check to basically just run PG is ready to check, is that container running? Yes. Or is the database actually ready? Yes. And then we can hand it off to the next thing in the dependency graph, right? So some key points to emphasize here, right? Having a reference to another resource or a field of another resource automatically creates a dependency. You don't have to add manual depends on fields, but if you need to, you can add those as well if you want to create explicit dependencies. Health checks are built into the system. Templates participate in that graph as well. And then it's declarative, not imperative. So for the main infrastructure components, you just describe what you want, not how to achieve it. If you need to run scripts, there's still resources to run your scripts. So there's an exec resource that'll still run those if you need to. But for a lot of setups, it'll be way lighter on scripts.
And in all of this, it also then supports parallelization, right? Which is kind of what's going to make it so that the end users can start their labs sooner rather than having to wait for a chain of events. Yes. You can do two things at once.
Exactly. So if we look at this dependency graph, right, we have a network, and that is often using all of the containers to connect them to that network. So to start my demo app, I will need the network to be available, right? So here side by side, we have basically the diagram and then the code that is the same. So we have a network, and then we're referencing that from our demo app container, right? That creates this dependency. So this will wait for the network to be ready. The low-key config in this file doesn't have any dependency, if I can find it. There we go. So it doesn't have any references, so it can immediately be created at the same time as the network. But the Loki container depends on that. So it will wait for the config to be created and for the network to be created because it has a dependency on that as well, right? So it fans out, it fans back in, and whatever can be done in parallel, the system will do in parallel. So let's say I have a bunch of containers that only depend on the network. As soon as the network is ready, which is almost instant, all of the containers will start at exactly the same time, and they don't have to wait on each other. And then in that dependency chain, if anything goes wrong, it automatically like stops everything after it. And so you'll get error reporting early, which really helps. You don't have to wait for a timeout or something like that, right? And so we can see like we have the Grafana data sources, which then depend on multiple things because it needs the container name of Prometheus, the container name of Loki. And so you see that it then converges back into the graph, and then the system figures that out on startup. So let's just go down. So this means that your really long scripts basically often can be condensed into smaller declarative pieces of configuration. And then you'll only use scripting where you actually need to run scripts and run commands, right? So Alex, what creates an implicit dependency in Instruqt 2.0?
Does my job depend on this?
Resource references, type ordering, or alphabetical ordering?
I would go with resource references. That's my final answer.
Oh, ding, ding, ding. That is correct. So as you might see, quizzes are now actually embedded in content, right? Which is really cool. You can sprinkle them throughout, and there's way more types of quizzes as well. And then they're all tied into unlock sequence, so we can actually go to the next chapter. So another important thing that Alex was mentioning is feedback and like getting feedback fast, right? So validation matters because with tracks, often what happens is you write your configuration, you publish it to the platform, all right? You have to start the lab or a learner starts the lab, which is even worse. And some error happens, right? You get a support request, you have to debug it while it's running or look at the logs, find it, fix it, publish again. And if those are like syntax errors or typos or configuration issues, that can be very wasteful, right? So what does this lead to? Like a lot of support time, frustrations by the end user, reputational damage, right? Because your labs are not stable. And then it might mean that you actually delay releases because you're not confident.
It also,
right?
yeah.
So what you want to do is actually go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to add, like, there's also that if you're doing a live event, that's incredibly anxiety provoking.
Yes. No, and errors always happen when you don't want them to, right? They work fine when you test it by yourself, and then 10 people do it, and then some timing thing happens, and then everything breaks, right? So what you actually want to do is you want to prevent runtime errors with code time validation. Because it catches errors way quicker, and you can prevent a lot of them actually, right? So you get fast feedback because they run in seconds instead of having to go through logs and try and debug things. They catch it before you deploy it, so nobody is impacted. They reduce the support burden because you don't get a support case for an error that doesn't reach production, right? And means you can iterate faster. So with validation, the flow becomes you write it, you run validate, you see the errors, fix them immediately, validate again, everything's good, and you confidently push. So let's just take a look at what that actually looks like by going through some validation. So let's just go into the right directory, and let's just run validate. So we're validating the lab, and we get an error, right? So it says resource not found, resource container Prometheus. So I'm just going to say Alex helped me with the config, and he made the typo. It wasn't me, but we'll fix it anyway. So we can see exactly where the error happened. We know it happened in the data sources HCL in the Grafana data source. So let's take a look at the file. We know it's in here. And then let's see where Alex made the typo, not me. There we go. And then we save it. And then we can run validate again. So let's just do that for correctness. All right, so it's valid. So this task, which you might equate to a challenge in the old system,
More like a check.
is now embedded, and we can actually go ahead.
Sorry, just to say that this task here, you can think of them like checks. So before we would have check scripts at the end of a challenge, you'd be able to run that and make sure that the users have done the correct steps. But we've evolved that into tasks here. So you can actually have multiple peppered wherever you want within the instructions. You don't have to have one per challenge. And it comes with more granular pieces as well. So I'm stealing a bit of Eric's thunder here. So, but you can see here, there's multiple steps within a challenge or within a check.
Yeah, and so each of these are conditions that need to be met in order for the task to correctly validate, right? And each of these conditions can in turn have multiple checks, and they can have setups and cleanups. So you can do a lot of distributed checking, or you can order them however you want, right? So let's validate this. All right, we've reviewed the output by running lab validate, so that's correct, and we fixed the spelling, right? So instead of spending 15 to 30 minutes looking in the logs of why did Grafana not start and couldn't it reach Prometheus, all it took us was 5 seconds. We knew immediately where to fix it and how to fix it, right? So this adds up. If you have like 10 typos, right, is hours of debugging, and then multiply that by the number of content.
And that was just a simple example, right, Eric? That was just a simple example, but validation itself is going to cover many things, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to go through like 3 common things that could go wrong. So like typos to a wrong reference is like a pretty common thing, I think. Another one is where we actually validate not just the config syntax itself, but also the markdown files with the content, where we can actually say, okay, so there's apparently an activity called verify setup in the page, but we aren't mapping it to an actual task. So let's take a look, right? What does that look like? So in here, we have a page. And so the page resource basically defines the markdown content, and then it can have activities embedded in it, multiple tasks and quizzes intermixed in your content, and even replace them with variables. And then you'd use them in this way, right? So you just say, okay, I want to embed a task, and I want this ID. So what happened here is somebody already updated the markdown, but they didn't add the task that it points to, or they forgot to do the mapping. So we can actually look, okay, the task exists, so it must have been the mapping, right? So that's what we're missing here. So let me just go grab the activities, right? And I'm basically saying, okay, map this ID to this actual task, right? And then I could have quizzes and things like that as well. So if we now run this again, we can see we passed this, right? So again, a lot of time saved where an end user clicks the validate button and nothing happens. And it's like, why doesn't it work? Is Instruqt not working, or is something in my content wrong, or is the script not running, or, you know, now we just caught it. We just forgot to map it. All right, next one. So another thing that could happen is somewhat the other way around, where we actually have a file mapped, but we forgot to create the actual file, right? So in this case, the error is we cannot create the task because we cannot open verifyconfig.sh, right? No such file or directory. Okay, so we go to tasks.htl, and then we can see that we actually have it mapped here, but the file doesn't exist yet, right? So the solution in this case is obviously we need to create the file. Now, just to showcase what Alex was saying before with the multiple conditions and that they're validated separately, I'm going to wait with hitting return here and run the check. So you can actually see that we did the first thing, we ran the validate, but we didn't fix the actual script yet, right? So once we then do this, we then actually get correct endpoint, right? Now, there are limits to what validation or code time validation can catch, right? It can do syntax errors, references that are wrong, or missing mappings, or just standard validation on fields that are invalid, type mismatches, etc. But there's also things it cannot catch, right? Like runtime errors, there's no way from the code to deduct that. Networking errors, you won't be able to know that until runtime. Logic errors, performance errors, or external dependencies that cannot be reached, right? So what you want to do is you want to use this static validation, but complement it still with testing your lab in the platform, adding health checks to your resources, running integrations tests, etc. Right? So if you can catch 60 to 70% of all the errors already with validation, that saves a huge amount of time.
And frustration.
So another big problem is collaboration, as Alex said. So collaborating between UI and code right now is very painful because I make a fix, and then Alex fixes a typo in the UI. He pushes last, and he didn't refresh the page. So Alex wins, and my fix is now out. And there's no way for me to figure out why that happened, when that happened, right? Like I'm just, why doesn't my fix work? Like I fixed it yesterday, and then I have to pull it again and then see, oh, it's gone, or why? So that can be very painful, right? And then like an extra annoying thing is there's no visibility in all of those changes. So you don't know why things have changed, right? There can be important changes and you don't understand why. So that often leads to people changing things back or fixing things or thinking they fix it, but actually breaking. To keep it somewhat shorter, right? We now actually support like UI and terminal working together nicely. But I'm not going to go through the conflict resolution because that'll just take up extra time. You can actually go through that yourself. But in the new creator UI,
I was just going to say there is conflict resolution in UI and in CLI. And then there's going to be change management in both as well.
Exactly. So what you can see here is like, this is the actual lab that I'm in, right? And you can see the change history here. And I can go into each of these and actually look at what the change was. I can see the actual commit message, who did it, and the git commit. And that is because when you're changing things in the UI, they actually turn into changes in code. And so they happily live together, right? And it preserves your ordering, formatting, comments, all of that, so that you can actually collaborate. But it also means that you don't have to force your less technical users to do code workflows where they might be uncomfortable or anxious about making changes. They can just use the UI and work happily together. And some changes are just better to do in the UI. Like if you're editing content, it might be nicer to just visually go through it and put the image in the right place in your page and things like that, right? So you can change all the content right here, preview it, make any changes, add any of the resources, edit containers, tasks, tabs, layouts, assets. It's all there and it's all version controlled, which is really important to us. And it's like one of the core principles we wanted to do with Instruqt 2.0. So from a terminal, like code workflow, what does it actually look like? Well, just your standard git changes, right? I make my change, right? I add the file, I commit it, and then I just push, right? And if someone in the UI at the same time made a change, I will see that there is a git conflict. I can resolve the conflict, and then I can push that change. If you want to work in parallel without like bothering other people, instead of duplicating your content to a dev slug and then replacing the IDs and doing that whole dance, you just create a Git branch and then you just work on that branch. And people in the UI, you can see, you can switch branches and you can see all of that. All works natively as well. So basically, you just do your normal Git workflow and don't have to build your own hacks around it. So some benefits that you get is you basically get audit trails, what happened, everything is version controlled with full history, and you can use industry standard tools like git log, git blame, etc. to figure out what's up. All right. Then another issue with scaling the content is the duplication problem. Like what we often see is that when people create new labs, they'll duplicate an existing one, change it, or they'll copy paste from an existing lab the bits that they want to use. But then what happens if you have 120 labs using Kubernetes and then you need to bump the version of Kubernetes? And then people copy paste it from your 120 labs into an additional 40 labs. How do you figure out which labs to change? Like so often you don't even know, right? So you spend a week just identifying which labs are affected, another 3 weeks to update all of them manually, and then you still miss 12 labs, right? So that's really painful.
And Eric,
So
just to
one of the benefits, go ahead.
Just to shift your narrative, this is also going to be supporting mono repos and multi repos, right?
Yes. Yeah. So like the Git workflows, mono repos, multi repos, they all work, right? But like to solve this duplication problem, what we're doing is we're introducing modules where basically I can create a module that I can then reuse in all of my labs, and there's one source of truth, right? So security patches, if I update the model once, every other lab then gets that patch automatically. All right, so what does that look like? So a module is basically just another piece of lab configuration where I have variables that are inputs to my module, so I can customize it and configure it. And then I have the resource that my module wants to spin up. So in this case, a container and a template. And then if I want to use values from in that module outside of the module, I can define outputs so that other resources can then use those again. So let's say I have my observability stack module. I can consume it from Git. We'll be introducing a module registry as well so that you can privately share that within your company, easily discover things, or publish public modules that our customers can share with each other, and where we can also share modules for people to use. And then as you can see here, you can
just as a grounding point or point of reference, we have sandbox presets today in the current product. Modules is going to be that, but better and for everything, right? So you'll be able to have modules of sandbox resources or instructional pieces or combination of both with nested modules as well.
And you can stack them, right? Like whereas with a preset, it's the entire thing. Whereas with modules, you can have multiple small modules that you then combine into bigger modules if you want to, and then reuse wherever you want, mix and match. It's basically Lego blocks then at that point, right? And then where you're using the module, you basically can customize it from the outside. And then if you want to reference something from the module, you just add a reference to the output that you've created inside of that module. And that automatically creates that dependency graph again, where everything inside of the module is actually part of that bigger graph as well. So all the orchestration is then handled automatically for you. So yeah, variables allow customization without having to fork the module. The outputs enable composition. And then you have a single source of truth, which is really useful because with the Kubernetes example, I patch the version once, and then every place where I use the module automatically gets that fix. And it has versioning support if you do want to pin versions of modules.
And
So
we will be building out permissions around modules as well. At first, it will be within your team. But as Eric mentioned, our vision here is to first enable you and your smallest teams to be able to have these modules so that you as a team start working faster, then sharing out with your other teams or departments, and eventually as a community starting to have modules from us, but also modules that you maybe want to share that other people can pick up and start collaborating on and using.
Yep. And like examples of modules that people could create is like Kubernetes cluster with standard configuration, with like ingress controllers set up or things like that. Maybe an IDE with plugins already and settings predefined to your labs. A database with seed data already in there. But besides sandbox components, you can also have like whole chapters where basically I have pages that describe the introduction to my product that we want in every lab. Just create a module of it and then reuse that everywhere so that you only actually need to update all the pages once, and then all the other labs benefit from there. Or what we could do as Instruqt is create an Instruqt basics module that has like an introduction to the platform for end users. How does a lab work? What do all the buttons do, etc. And how do I navigate everything? That you as customers could then just grab and reuse in all of your labs where you want to have that introduction. Or create quiz question libraries where you have a bunch of questions about your product and then you just use them where you want, or layouts, etc. Right? The options are endless. And so if you want to use like mono repos here again, you can reference like modules from mono repos if you want to manage them that way. And you can just use versioning everywhere as well. Right, so you can do things like this where I'm saying from that branch or from that tag, etc. So this makes the maintenance way lighter because you only have to update one thing. You can do it as a shared thing within your organization. It's more consistent, but it also means that if you're starting fresh with Instruqt, it actually allows you to reuse building blocks that either Instruqt has already created or our customers, and then reuse those building blocks so you don't have to create them from scratch, right? So hopefully this will allow the community to create a flywheel where a bunch of basic building blocks are already done and you can just compose them into your lab. And so you can focus on the actual business value of your lab. All right, so we kind of talked through this one already, right? What is the value of that? I just mentioned those. Another issue that a lot of people are having are assets, right? Like we talked about the here doc thing before. This is one of them where I cannot have my asset files easily everywhere. Like I can have images and things like that and share those, but config files, and if I want to template those, I have to resort to putting them in scripts, and that's painful. Right, and it's just terrible to review, terrible to debug. So let me just go to the next one quickly, right? Just skipping the less important ones so that we can focus on the more important ones, and then you can review the lab yourself to go through this later. But basically what's now possible is if you have images that are local to your lab, right, and not shared with other labs, you can just put them in the assets folder of your lab and they'll be immediately served. So all the images that I had in my lab were just served from my lab directly. And if I have configuration files or templates, or maybe an entire code repo, I can just embed those in files or Terraform modules or whatever. and they'll all be available within the repo. So let's say I have a template for Prometheus config. I just point at that local file. It's then ingested. I can then replace any variables in that file with whatever I want just by adding them here, and I can use references there. And that automatically gets rendered, and then you can use that in other places in your lab by adding references to this. Or if you need to copy things from the outside, you can use a copy resource that'll pull it from an HTTP endpoint or from GitHub. And that again, then pulls it locally, but it's in the dependency graph so that you can actually build dependencies on these config files and other assets that you want in your lab, right? Something to call out that you might have already noticed, but we've basically been in this lab continuously. We've done quizzes, we've worked in terminals, like we've done a bunch of different things, but we never left the lab. We didn't go out of the challenge, read notes, go back into the next challenge, complete it, go out of the challenge, like rinse, repeat. Basically, you can just stay in your lab continuously. And as a content creator, you have the flexibility of shaping that flow. If you want to have just a bunch of pages that you read through, and then have some tasks at the end, you can have that. You can mix and match task quizzes, however you want, put multiple on a single page. That all works. And then we're also introducing a lot of extra components for the content. So if you want to embed a PDF, you can just do that natively. You can have videos. You can have Google Slides in there. I think we'll add other ones as well, like video. I think we support Vimeo already. And then we can keep expanding that way easier now than the way we did before. So this will help your end user be more immersed in their content.
And you're not distracting them because of a limitation on our side, right? You don't have to have instructions sitting there. You can have a full screen.
Exactly. So this is basically the end of the lab, as you can see. And then the end component is another one of those components that you can now customize yourself, where you can change the messages, change what the button says, change where you place it. You can add images, text, feedback forms, etc. around it, and be more flexible. Because part of what we want to achieve is that it fits more with your actual use cases instead of us confining you into a single one. So as I said before, we'll share the lab source with you. Reach out to one of our representatives or email us at hello@instruqt.com. Alex, I'll hand it back to you.
I don't think I need to say anything more. Just really grateful for everybody tuning in and asking their questions. And thank you, Eric. And we have more to show you, right? Eric has not touched on everything in this demo. So looking forward to connecting with all of you.
All right. Thank you all for joining.